You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Hello, friend, and welcome to episode 154 of the Business for Good podcast. Now, I mentioned this is episode 154, which means, of course, that there are 153 back episodes with awesome and inspiring content just waiting for you to check out. Nearly all of them are evergreen and great. But if you want to start with listener favorites, you can see on our homepage at businessforgoodpodcast.com, which are the most all-time downloaded episodes, and you can go by the wisdom of the crowd, if you please. Okay. If you listen to the show, you're likely already familiar with the topic of cultivated meat. We did a recent series focused on this topic, episodes 132 through 143, that coincided with the 2024 release of my updated book, Clean Meat: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. There are a few people as knowledgeable about the past and present of cultivated meat, and perhaps even its future, as Eric Schulze. Eric loves the intersection of science and food so much that after many years as an FDA regulator, he decided in 2016 to leave the federal government to join the then-nascent Memphis Meats, which is now Upside Foods. He'd go on to spend the next 7 years working to advance the cultivated meat pioneers' science, technology, communications, and ultimate regulatory approval by the agency for which he used to work. Now, Eric's charting a new path for himself, founding GoodHumans, a consultancy aimed at assisting and even launching biotech startups seeking to bring their new innovations to the world. In this episode, Eric and I discuss the state of the cultivated meat movement today and where it may be heading. This includes the path to commercialization, the obituaries being written for the sector, the statewide bans on the product, and comparisons to other technologies too. We even discuss our mutual love of sci-fi and give some recommendations to those of you fellow nerds out there. Eric is a wealth of knowledge on all things alt protein. So if you want both information and inspiration, listen to what he's got to say. Also, one quick correction. I say in this conversation that the publicity dinner to promote refrigerated foods was held in 1920. In actuality, it was 1911. Shame on me. Now you know the truth. Okay, now on to the show. Eric, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Paul, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure to get to see you, and I'm really happy that we're talking. You have a really interesting background, I got to say. Like a lot of the people who come into this space, maybe they came from, the animal welfare or the environmental movement. You were an FDA regulator. You're like a science guy who decided that you wanted to maybe not work in the federal government doing novel food regulations, but instead do this. So first, let me just ask you, how did you become an FDA regulator? Like, how's that a career path for somebody? What did you do that led you into that position?
I will tell you, I ask myself the same question all the time. How did I go work for big bureaucracy? I didn't know, honestly, I was recruited. So I was recruited to the U.S. government and specifically the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And this was very early in the Obama administration first term. I was completing my PhD out in Los Angeles, where I currently reside, at the University of Southern California. I was getting an interdisciplinary PhD. It was a brand new project they were trying out, which was trying to teach PhD students to think more in systems rather than reductive and work on cross-cutting initiatives. And at that point, we were coming off of the Bush era stem cell initiatives and all that stuff. And I was doing stem cell research, and the government came knocking, and they were like, hey, do you want to put all this to good use for all these new technologies that are coming out that people are making drugs and food with? And so I was like, no. My initial reaction was no. I was being recruited by companies. I knew that I didn't want to work in academia outright, but I thought I would go to industry. And the bottom line is the government was persistent, and they were like, we're going to be a startup within the Obama administration. We're going to work on new technologies. You're going to look ahead rather than looking back. And I can speak more to this later, but it was fascinating to work for the U.S. government and getting an inside look at how businesses are run because of how transparent they have to be with the U.S. government. So you really got an unvarnished look at business operations in sort of novel spaces. And a lot of ideas are percolating there.
Were there cool things that you were evaluating that when you were there that, let's say, maybe not relevant to the alternative meat or alternative protein world, but just cool things that you were evaluating?
Yeah, I was working, which is weird. I was working on both food and drug problems. Like, that's very odd that you jump across that legal barrier between the two here in the United States. So I got to see and work on some very cool stuff, including lots of novel antiviral therapies that relied on genetically engineered viruses to combat viruses. And then importantly, those drugs that were being developed were also the same genetically engineered virus was being used to treat both like our pets and humans. Like, it had dual use. And then in the afternoon, I'd go work on a genetically engineered animal like the Aqua Bounty, Aqua Advantage salmon, which was the first genetically engineered food animal that got approval here in the US.
Yeah, I remember that. I didn't realize that you had worked on that. I was just last night debating with a friend of mine, actually. So it's interesting you're talking about stem cells and genetically engineered viruses. And we were talking about the movie Gattaca. Did you see it?
Of course.
Yeah, of course, right? Obviously, it's such a good movie. If you've not seen it, highly recommend it. But the basic premise is, that society becomes like a caste system based on genetics, right? That you have to have certain genetic traits to get certain jobs in societies. Like, if you want to be an astronaut, you need to get your blood tested to make sure that. And the way that people accomplish this is through essentially like in vitro fertilization, where they're selecting for the best traits. And the movie is presented as dystopian. But I was thinking, and I was arguing last night, if you could do this, wouldn't most parents pay to make their kids smarter? Like, if you could take a neonatal vitamin that made your kid's IQ higher, probably most people would do it. And similarly, if you could pay to have some type of, in vitro therapy that would make your kid smarter, you probably would do it, right? I mean, it doesn't seem that dystopian to me. Obviously, it's a shame because the rich will be able to afford to make their kids smarter, but still, I'm just saying, anybody who could afford to do it, don't you think most people would do it?
Jumping right into the ethical quandaries. Yeah. I love it, Paul. Well, yeah. So on one hand, you have Elysium, if you've seen that movie or read that.
More recent. Okay, good. I like that one too. Yeah.
Which is sort of, again, what you just said, like the rich sort of taking advantage and sort of hoarding all of that genetic material, like advantage.
Right.
Rapidly.
As opposed to today, where the rich don't have any advantages.
But I think in Elysium, what I thought was interesting is that basically because they had access to capital and these extra genetic enhancements or whatever, they got such a head start that they were that even if people could afford them that were lower socioeconomic status, they could never sort of catch up with the rate. It was exponential for the rich and linear for the poor. And so even if that was equalized, I think it was interesting, for like, I think most people, you're right, would take a very simple solution if it were proven to be like relatively safe and reasonably affordable. But I think also, again, with genetically engineered animals, like we've been able to do this for 50 years. And our agricultural stocks, like the pigs and cows and chickens, like their genes have been highly selected for genetically for certain traits. And again, we can debate whether that is a net positive or net negative for the planet and humanity and those animals themselves. But the scientific fact is that we can do this already.
Right. And, those animals, to be clear, are not being selected for intelligence. They're being selected for, high rates of egg production or fast growth rates and so on. And yeah, I mean, my general view is that it probably is, a benefit to humans to some extent at the great severe detriment to those animals who have all types of health and welfare problems as a result of it. But it does make food production more efficient for sure.
Absolutely.
So there's a benefit to humans, although let's talk about making food production even more efficient by removing those animals from the equation altogether, which is what you ultimately devoted yourself to. After many years of being an FDA regulator, you decided, I'm going to leave the government and go directly into the industry. And you were one of the first employees at Memphis Meats, which is now Upside Foods, of course. And I remember it was this really big deal when Ovoletti brought you on. They're bringing on like somebody from the FDA early. And I thought this is a really smart idea. But why'd you do it? Did they recruit you too? Were you just the subject of constant recruitment efforts, whether to the government or to these tiny startups? What was the reason that you decided, hey, I want to go try to make meat without animals?
The honest to God answer is Reddit. I discovered then Memphis Meats on Reddit. They had just made the meatball.
It was like the $16,000 meatball or something like that, right?
18.
Oh,
18.
Excuse me. Thank you. Yeah,
18, which was
too
still
optimistic.
And it made the front page of Reddit. And as an ardent Redditor, I saw it and I thought to myself, oh, yeah, of course. Like scientifically, this makes a ton of sense. At the time, I was running an organization in DC that sought to sort of community build around art and science. And I would, as the founder and creative director there, I would often have to do a monologue early on to sort of set the tone for one of the events. And I needed material. So I decided to talk about then Memphis Meats and the concept of growing your meat, 3D printing it, all that stuff. And then I forgot about it. Now, keep in mind also at the FDA at this point, we were coming to the tail end of the second Obama term. We had done a lot. I'd also been really frustrated, candidly. Like the government is amazing, and I've always been really good about like the hard work that they do. But also at the same time, like progress is slow compared to a startup. And I really wanted to go see what a startup would be like. I frankly went from one extreme to the other, and at the time, Memphis Meats and Uma were sort of hiring people he knew from his community. And I was, I think, the first person that was sort of really outside of this world of alternative protein that had a genuine interest. So the other version of this, or the shorter answers, I really wanted to prevent the problems I was seeing at the government with companies coming in to see if I could affect change from the private sector side. And see, I had a couple of hypotheses in my head about how to run a business that would get through US government regulation and therefore get to marketing consumers much faster. That was my risk that I was taking in my head. And so I bolted for the West Coast, having never really been to San Francisco. And I, left FDA on a Thursday and started at Upside Foods, then Memphis Meats on a Monday.
Wow. Amazing. Well, it's interesting you say, you wanted to try to accelerate the path to regulatory approval and commercialization for this industry. So let me just ask you the blunt question, because, here we are now 8 years later. And there is very little cultivated meat on the market. There's essentially none in the US, and there's like single digit kilos in Singapore. And, you and I are both cheerleaders for this industry. So I'll answer my own question after you answer yours. But if somebody told you in 2016, when you started at Memphis Meats, that in 2024, there would be no cultivated meat on the market in the United States, would you have been surprised, or would you have thought, yeah, that sounds about right?
Yeah, I would say that sounds about right. The default, unfortunately, is very slow paths to market. By the way, you can't see me, but air quoting very slow. What I mean by that is they underestimate the length and complications of the journey, like in the regulatory system in any country, and they over-index on their ability to mature a technology to market. And I don't think either are necessarily like wrong positions to take. But I think what then, Memphis Meats and Upside the forethought to do was to double down on regulation as a part of the design constraint process of the product. I really enjoyed that regulation was a design constraint when designing a cultivated meat product. But now there's this larger issue that is both a combination of the company's responsibilities to like get to market and like what they're doing or not doing that are preventing them from doing that faster. And then, of course, on the US government side or all these other countries as well, how fast they're moving and able to like move a product through the regulatory paradigm. And I mean, this too. You've dealt with FDA in your business as well. And it can be very frustrating without the right expertise. And even with the right expertise, it can be incredibly onerous.
Yeah, for sure. I can resonate with what you're saying. Let me put it to you then in an augmented way, which is the following. So, Upside got regulatory approval more than a year ago. Same with Good Meat or Eat Just. And so that's not the reason they're not selling in the US now. What is? Like, what do you perceive as the reason? They've had more than a year of approval behind them now. What is the reason why there is no cultivated meat for sale in your view?
Well, I can say now, I'm no longer, a full-time employee at Upside Foods, and I work with a lot of cultivated meat players, both domestically and internationally, and of course with the governments, helping as someone also who brought that product to market, design the policy around it. It is largely in part to two factors. One, companies made a lot of mistakes or have been making mistakes in how they approach bringing a product to market that really stretch like the ability for a regulator to say, well, if you do it a little differently, you can get to market. We can understand why you did it this way. They're having to start over and redo significant portions of aspects of what they're doing. And again, we can talk about why that may have happened or not. On the other hand, the U.S. government went through, especially at FDA, just went through a major restructuring of their authority, and they have had to play catch up. And whereas with what I worked on, the first products didn't make it out, for 15 years. So I think, again, some of this comes down to both the government and the companies not knowing how to speak to each other efficiently, or thinking that they are, but they aren't. But what I'm hopeful for is that we'll see more approvals this year.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I certainly hope that too. As you know, there are some people who love to drink the haterade, and their argument is it's not that there's some problem with the government or the communication. It's that it's just not technologically possible to do this in any type of an economical way. That's their argument. I'm not identifying with that, but that's their claim. But as somebody who is, a great technical expert in this, why do you think they're wrong? Like, I presume you think that this can actually make it to market and economically.
Yeah.
Right? So why are the haterade consumers wrong?
So, Paul, we're in the trough of disillusionment, which is, and I tell people, completely normal for a brand new field. Also, it's less than a decade old since Upside was founded. I don't think, stepping back, the progress is incredible. And deep tech like biology is incredibly expensive and long lead. The fact that we have anything on market is frankly amazing. That said, to the sort of technical questions, which, by the way, is totally valid for constructive criticism in science is like the bedrock of what we do. So as much as I may disagree, I appreciate the criticism. I fundamentally disagree with a lot of the critiques because they fundamentally omit innovation from their analyses, like the possibility of it improving. Now, I've heard very few people say this, but I will say, like, I have a David Deutschian approach to science, the Oxford or the UK quantum physicist and philosopher, if you're familiar with him, Paul. And
we'll include a link to the show notes in this episode, and so people can go read more about him.
David Deutsch, in many of his approach to modern science, is that unless it's explicitly forbidden by the laws of physics, it is a soluble problem. Now, it may be very expensive, it may take a long time, but it is fundamentally a problem for knowledge generation and technological ability. And I think that cultivated meat, from the evidence I've seen, continuously beats all naysayers. Like, even when Uma Valetti, who founded this industry formerly in the commercial industry, people told him he was crazy for trying to start this. And then, within 2.5 years, we had a product that was within reach of conventional meat products in terms of price. And that everyone said it was impossible. So again, at the end of the day, I think that we haven't even let companies try to fail, in the sense that no one has reached commercial scale yet. I think that's the proof in the pudding, frankly. And then the second thing is, will consumers buy it? Is which you are very familiar with, is like, you have to build a product that people want. And we just haven't hit that scale yet.
Yeah, so let me offer a response in reverse order. So on the idea of consumer acceptance, there's so many different polls asking consumers whether they would eat cultivated meat or not. And as you know, the way that you word the poll does have a big impact on how people respond. But the polls go really anywhere from 20% acceptance to 80% acceptance. So let's just presume they're all wrong except for the worst, right? So it's only 20%. Could you imagine if cultivated meat led to a 20% reduction in the demand for animal meat? I mean, it would be the biggest revolution in food history, maybe. So, I just think, like, even if you believe that only 1/5 of people are going to be willing to eat it, that is going to have absolutely revolutionary impact. Now, I actually think it's bigger than that. I mean, you look at lots of polls, people say what they would or wouldn't eat. And I think that the better way to judge this is what actually happens in the market once this product is available, rather than what people hypothetically say about this thing that isn't even available for them to purchase. But I think this is like the least of the concern as to whether people will eat it or not. I truly believe it's not even in the top 10 things to be worried about with regard to cultivated meat. Now, with regard to this other point, I agree. I think, clearly new inventions need to be made in order to make cultivated meat a viable product. But many inventions have been made. I mean, a few years ago, the big knock was that, you still had to use fetal bovine serum, and now most people aren't using it anymore, right? And so that was the big thing was, this requires these farmer-grade conditions. You have to use FBS. And folks are finding ways to bring that down. And it reminds me of 10, 15 years ago, the obituaries that we saw for the electric vehicle industry. Routinely, you would see Obama being knocked for it. You'd see Washington Post columns talking about the stupidity of electric vehicles. And now in California, where you and I both live, EVs are going to be the only types of cars that are even allowed to be sold in about a decade from now. Other states are doing this. General Motors said they're phasing out all internal combustion engines. And now everybody knows the future of the vehicle industry is internal combustion free, right? And so a decade ago it was impossible. Now everybody says it's inevitable. Is that going to be the same here? I don't know. I don't know if that will happen, because maybe the money will run out from investors or from other sources of funding. But I do think that given enough time and funding, that there is a pathway to continuing to innovate, as you put it, and create cheaper, better products. Do you think that's right?
I think this is just as you have so eloquently put it in the past, like this is just the next synthetic ice argument. It's the next margarine versus butter war. It's this idea that you can't imagine a new product without precedent. So I completely agree. And I will say, just to be fair, my science side would say, like, the Volvo CEO just came out and said that they're rolling back actually their commitment to EVs as aggressively. They were going to go a full fleet EV, and they've rolled it back without sort of specifying exactly why. I thought that was really interesting that they're the only company I've seen that's rolled back that EV mandate for their fleet.
Right. And who knows if that's anomalous or a blip, or, is it to use a intended pun, is it a speed bump or is it a roadblock? Like, we don't know
exactly
what that will be.
But I think you're right. Fundamentally, it is a matter of investor. And this is another thing that has to change fundamentally for Cultivated to get there, because you bring up the most important point: a 20% change in the meat supply, switching over to an alternative protein like cultivated meat, would be the most fundamental shift in human diets in over 1 million years.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. So I'll tell you something interesting. And it's actually, I'm glad you brought up synthetic ice, which I do love to use that because it's such a good analogy for what is happening in meat right now. But for those not familiar, first, for thousands of years, the only way we had to get ice was out of nature. Then all of a sudden we had refrigeration, which allowed us to make ice, like human-made ice. And there was a big campaign against what was called artificial ice or synthetic ice. There was a lobbying campaign against it. There's a Natural Ice Association that was formed in order to try to defend and protect the incumbent natural ice industry. They claimed it was ungodly. It went against nature, like all these things that they want you just to eat, so-called natural ice. And of course, now you fast forward to today, and we all have artificial ice makers in our homes. We call them freezers. We don't think there's anything unnatural about it at all. But what's really interesting is that I'm actually reading a book right now. It's called Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves, by a woman named Nicola Twiley. And I got to endorse this book. It's really, really interesting, and I'm learning so much from it. I'll include a link to it in the show notes at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But I'll tell you a fact that will blow your mind, Eric, if you didn't already know it. I certainly didn't know it, which is that people were so afraid of refrigerated food about 110 years ago that it was widely believed that this was bad for you. Because think about it, for all of human history, you had to eat food that was either freshly slaughtered or harvested, right? Otherwise, it would go bad. So most people had never eaten meat that came from an animal, who wasn't slaughtered more than a couple of days ago, right? And with refrigeration, this changed everything. And all of a sudden, you could eat meat from an animal who was slaughtered a year ago, and it would be fine for you to eat. But people thought this was so unnatural. They were so afraid of it that a trade association for the refrigerated foods industry in 1920 put on a banquet as a publicity stunt in 1920 in Washington, D.C., to serve only food that had been previously refrigerated to prove that this food was safe to eat. So for the first time in human history, it was a banquet where every single food consumed would have been previously refrigerated. And the Journal of the American Medical Association published an editorial condemning them, saying this did not prove anything. This is still unsafe. You could just see, like, I don't know, was the next editorial saying, you should, protect yourself by smoking some Marlboros? I don't know. Like, it was like, it was like so unbelievable that JAMA was against refrigerated food, whereas now we know it's like one of the greatest public health advancements in all of human history is refrigeration of food.
Yeah, they were like, hey, stop eating that ice, as they took a big draw on a Marlboro Red.
Right, yeah, right, exactly. And, you could just see this playing out today, a century later. You could just see this, people saying, hey, this isn't natural. This isn't right to eat meat that wasn't produced from animal slaughter. So anyway, it's a pretty interesting book. And there's so much more in this book that's interesting also that I won't belabor in this particular conversation. But yes.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, as a biologist, like, cancer is natural doesn't mean it's good. So not everything that's quote unquote natural, and the naturalistic fallacies invoked all the time in cultivated meat and alternative proteins.
Right.
I just take a very simple approach to this. Like, assuming it's safe, let's assume we can agree to that. Just let a consumer decide. Like, let's just let consumers decide. And if they don't like it, they'll vote with their pocketbooks.
Yeah, so let me ask you about that. As you know, there are states like Florida and Alabama that don't want to let consumers decide, that have banned this product now from sale, even though it's never been sold there. They're essentially, killing this baby in the cradle, or maybe in the womb even, since it hasn't even been born. But what do you think about this? I mean, obviously, I know that you oppose these bans, but how big of a problem do you view this? Do you think, well, there's so little on the market now, we still have 48 other states that we can play in? Or do you view this as a really serious threat that needs to be paid attention to right now?
I think it's serious in the sense that, like, we have to stand up to it. Like, you have a voice in the conversation, and as someone who ran policy for Upside for many years, the most important thing to realize is that whether you like politics, whether you like lobbying or not, you have to play the game because you have a voice. And if you say nothing, someone will speak for you. And it may not be what you like. And so this is what I tell young scientists when they're getting into this, that, like, understanding policy is just as important as understanding the science of what you do. But to your question about the bans, I think that I'm less concerned for a meat and poultry company, a cultivated company, than I am for a cultivated seafood company. And without going into a lot of detail about the law, the short answer is that USDA in general in court cases has the ability to sort of the superior courts have argued for years that basically, because of the way the law is structured, USDA has ultimate authority over what gets done or not done in terms of meat, poultry. But with FDA, states can make that decision a little bit more leniently. They don't always agree with FDA on food decisions. So since seafood is regulated by FDA by a large part, and USDA regulates meat, poultry, these bans are going to be overturned by what's called federal preemption protections. And they're being challenged, I think, that way as well. What do I think about these bans? I've been very upfront about this. I think it is rank protectionism. And I'm very, very rarely this blunt about it, but it's such nakedly protectionist policies that I can't even come up with a even convincing moderate reason as to why they would approach it this way in terms of. So it is a play at, rules for me, rules for thee, but none for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we were talking about this at a conference recently, and, there's a similar case that went to the Supreme Court recently regarding California's restrictions on what pork and eggs can be sold in the state. And California implemented what's called Proposition 12, which says that you can't sell eggs or pork in the state if they came from animals who were confined to the point of immobilization, essentially. And the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that it wasn't federally preempted. Now, the point that you were making, which I think is a good one, because I hadn't thought about this, is that that's talking about on-farm treatment of animals, where there is no USDA rules. There's not a single rule at the federal level at all, USDA or otherwise, that relates to the on-farm treatment of animals. But you make a different argument that this isn't really about on-farm treatment. So what's your argument, legally speaking, as to why you think this will be preempted federally?
Great question. I'm not a lawyer. So just very important. You bring up a good point.
But I've used ChatGPT to look at this, so I figured that must make me an expert, right?
Who hasn't? That's right. Okay. So for the listeners, just important to know, in the U.S., FDA regulates, they have the authority to basically regulate, as Paul was correctly noting, like on animals on the hoof. Animals, before we intend to slaughter them for food, their health is regulated by FDA. USDA regulates everything about an animal once you intend to slaughter them. So from slaughter through processing, labeling, all that stuff. That's how the law splits. That's so Paul's saying basically, which is correct, that when it comes to the treatment of animals, that's FDA land. And then again, federal preemption is a little different because without going into legal arguments there, for the USDA side in cultivated meat, these are processing arguments. Like we don't have an animal. We don't have, we have tissue that we're processing into and cells into food products. This is like manipulating ground beef, which clearly is a USDA regulated activity. So the case is that, one, I mean, frankly, as I've talked with other lawyers, this is believed completely unconstitutional and a gross overreach of legal authority to just preemptively ban a product in the absence, in fact, in contradiction to federal safety data that says these products are safe and they are truthfully labeled. But I think it just comes down to, very simply, you have a meat product like ground beef or chicken thighs or something like that, and somebody's coming in and saying, you can't sell these even though everybody has said they're safe, you can access them, they have their price right, whatever. We just don't like them. We don't like that they're called this or that they exist. And that's just not a good reason to legally to say you can't have this food. That's up to a consumer to decide.
Right. And if you look at the legislative history of these bills, especially in Florida, the proponents are extremely clear as to why they are doing it, which is not to protect consumers from confusion, but rather to protect cattlemen from competition, right? Like this is not a matter of any type of consumer protection. It's solely about incumbent industry protection, essentially.
And I'll say this too, like as someone who's worked under this big tent, built this big tent of like a wide stakeholder set, like I've worked with the cattlemen for years, both at federal level, at state level. And I've worked with every major barnyard organization, the pork and chicken and beef and blah. And like by and large, most people support the existence of these products. And they just say like, listen, I may not like them, but again, they deserve to compete on market. And who am I to say consumers may or may not want it? I think the urge for this comes from the, smaller cattle ranchers and livestock producers who see this as a threat to their livelihood and don't realize that the spool up to scale up and having even a 20% market disruption, it only takes the delta of the growth. Like it wouldn't even impact their own operations most likely for the next 20 to 30 years. They would still be able to sell their product. And frankly, they should have to compete, in my opinion.
Yeah. So, and to be fair, the North American Meat Institute has opposed these bans. Like it's not
Correct.
as if the meat industry or the incumbent meat industry is somehow a monolith again in favor of these. In fact, quite the opposite.
Oh, and you bring up a good point about the North American Meat Institute. Their opposition to it is not only just because they think it's a silly and stupid ban. It also sets a precedent that says the cultivated and alternative industries could bring arguments forth that say, we don't like this meat product. It should never exist. And they don't want that starting to happen. So I don't think people realize the double-edged sword that this would create legally. Yeah. And I guarantee you somebody's going to bring suit and say, we don't want these conventional meat products on market. We just don't like them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an interesting idea. I wonder when that'll be. So you mentioned the delta of the growth, right? So, the meat industry is projected to continue growing. Meat demand is projected to continue increasing, not only in the US, but around the world, not just because of increased human population. That's one reason, but also because people are getting wealthier. So they're going to eat more meat. So let me ask you this. Plant-based meat has now been on the market for decades. And if you want to be fair, you'd say, hey, the latest generation of plant-based meat, like the Beyonds and the Impossibles that are more, let's say, realistic mimicries of animal meat, have been on the market for, let's say 8 or so years right now. But they're still not 1% of the volume of animal meat, right? They're still less than 1% of the total volume of animal meat in America, and even less so around the world. How long do you think it'll take for cultivated meat to reach the place where plant-based meat is today, meaning some type of a meaningful fraction of 1% of the incumbent meat industry?
I think that I think we're right now, and we talked about this earlier, we're limited by the volume that's available. Like the advantage that plant-based products and mycelium-based products have is that they can be on market more or less like now.
Right. I mean, corn, QUORN, has been growing mycelium in bioreactors for decades and makes hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue a year from it and is in thousands of supermarkets. In fact, I went to London and was in the KFC there, and they had corn patties literally on price parity with the chicken patties. It was really incredible to see food grown inside of bioreactors competing on cost in a fast food setting with the lowest cost meat, chicken. So, but even then, it's still is a very insignificant portion of the total volume of meat. It's a rounding error in the total meat industry. So if you were to think, hey, when is cultivated meat going to get to that point where it's not at 0.0%, but let's say, close to 1%, do you think it's in the 2030s, the 2040s? Like, what do you realistically think might happen?
Yeah. I mean, scientists are terrible at prognostication, so take this with a grain of salt. But again, I think it's another decade or sooner. It really comes down to who can produce at scale. I mean, this as someone who's running a business, the only thing that matters is scale. You can produce prototypes, you can come up with ideas so the cows come home, but the make or break is, can you get to scale, to commercial or industrial scale?
And what is scale to you? Right now, the largest bioreactor for mammalian cell culture on the planet is 20,000 liters. Is that scale? Or, some companies have talked about 200,000 liter reactors in the future. What is scale to you?
Yeah. It can be different forms, but you're right. A 20 or 50,000 liter, 20K or 50K reactor run in parallel with a bunch of other 20 or 50Ks. You need to be in the equivalent of 500,000 liter bioreactors like in pharma. And I think the ARC Biosciences CEO, who's there, he's brought up several times, I think I think this is a fair criticism. There's just not enough reactor space available for Cultivated to make that impact right now. That said, that's not because we can't make that reactor space. It just doesn't yet exist. And also precludes high efficiency products that don't necessarily need as much reactor space. So I think we're missing contract manufacturer organizations that we can lease out to cultivated producers. I think that's the biggest thing. Instead of making every producer build their own plant, having a Cargill or a Tyson, these large meat manufacturers, get on board, and which they are, and produce cultivated meat products with the infrastructure they have, I think is one. And then of course you got to build a product that tastes good. I think the adoption of a cultivated product will be potentially much faster than plant-based, not because plant-based is inherently worse, but because cultivated can more easily, I think, slot into a meat eater's diet. And I'm a meat eater, and I have incorporated plant-based products into my diet much more reasonably, or much more since working in this industry. But I still eat meat. And I still want meat. So if I had a cultivated option that was cheaper or the same price and just more ethically sound or climate sound, I would pick it up in its heartbeat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been a vegan for over 30 years, but I still like the taste of meat, which is why I eat plant-based meat, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a perfect mimicry of animal-based meat, but it does a sufficient job for me. I don't think it does a sufficient job for most meat eaters, though, especially on price, but even on texture. On taste, it's advanced a lot. And on texture, I think especially Impossible Foods has done a really good job of this. But by and large, plant-based meat today still leaves many meat consumers wanting, especially when it comes to price and also texture. And the question is, will further advancement in plant-based meat and further innovation in the mycelium world render cultivated meat obsolete? I don't know, but I sure think it's worth betting on it, right? It's kind of like
what a great competition to be in.
Yeah.
A market competition. That's another thing needs to happen, Paul, is having more market competition in the alternative protein space that isn't just plant versus mycelium or plant versus plant, not even plant versus cultivated, which I don't think cultivated really sees themselves as a plant-based competitor, but there needs to be lots of competition within the alternative space that I don't think is there. And I know that's really important also for some of your viewers too, is just this idea of where can I put my brain power, which we can talk about.
Yeah. Where should they put it? If you want, you're no longer working at Upside. So if you had to advise listeners on where they should put their brain power, what do you see as missing right now from the alternative protein space that you would like to see somebody start?
Two things, two areas, and I will freely give away my ideas because I think they're important. Somebody just needs to do them. One, we need more support ecosystem or B2B Like people need to be creating B2Bs in the alternative protein space, especially cultivated. B2Cs are very hard to do, and we need more infrastructure in this space. So one, creating things that support cultivated, like making cell lines, making scaffolds, making microcarriers, improving cell culture media, building bioreactors, like the things that make cultivated happen instead of a company like Upside, which had to build everything because it didn't exist. We should be having an off-the-shelf solutions so that build versus buy equation becomes a lot more easy to resolve. That's one. And I would work specifically in solving for standardized modular parts to the cultivated space. So high performance cell lines in each species, high performance scaffolds and microcarriers, and really efficient cell culture media, and then post-processing into the food product. That's where I would put my energy. That's one thing. The other thing, which I have less ideas for, and I'd love to hear your take, Paul, is creating competition directly with cultivated that is not a cultivated product. And not because I don't believe in cultivated. I'm a big believer in it. I want to see more. What's the alternative to cultivated products? And not just a plant-based product or mycelium. Like, what is the next thing after this that would help push and create new innovations within cultivated and force them to have a market to compete within? I don't know the answer to that one.
I certainly don't know the answer, but being that I like to make most of my decisions based on pure speculation rather than on evidence, I will.
As a good human should.
Yes, right, exactly. I want to align myself with my species here. I wonder, like, I'm such a big believer in microbial farming, right? Like, as somebody who's a big believer in mycelium, which is essentially microscopic fungi, I see the power that it has over plants and animals, right? And so the question is, not just can we make alternative meat from microscopic fungi, but can we do other types of microbial farming that might create cheaper and more efficient feedstocks for cultivated meat, as an example? So rather than plant-based feedstocks or animal-based feedstocks, you have microbial feedstocks, right? So that's one idea. But I would love to hear from somebody more informed than I am on this as to why that is either one, already happening, or two, planned to be happening. I don't know. But email us at businessforgoodpodcast.com. as our email address is on there. So email if you want to let me know, and I'll on the next episode indicate whether this has been the case or not. I do want to ask you, Eric, so you're talking about ideas you hope other people will do, but tell us just briefly, what are you doing? Right? You're no longer at Upside. You're now consulting. You're helping other companies. So you're not putting your brain power toward B2B cultivated meat solutions. You're putting brain power toward something else. What is it?
Well, as you said, yes, I left Upside over a year ago and launched my own agency called GoodHumans as a reminder to sort of like why I'm doing this. And I help. It has a couple of practice areas. One, of course, is helping cultivated companies sort of get to market. And I do that through a variety of mechanisms because I was an executive at Upside. So I serve at sort of fractional C-suite positions, depending on the company. Sometimes it's chief technical or chief regulatory or senior advisor to CEO, what have you. Sometimes even just sort of shadow CEOing. But like, that's one area. The other is launching companies. And I actually did launch a B2B company in the space called Nextra Bio with Taryn Wolf and, the growth of Big Idea Ventures. And that is doing scaffolds for cultivated meat products and novel attachment factors. And so this enabling technology. And then the other aspect, which is looking forward and going like we were talking about, is how do I create teams and or get companies funded for what could be, thought of as competition? What's the next iteration of this space in the food space? Like, this can't be the pinnacle of innovation. I don't mean that negatively. I think that's incredible. Like, Cultivated set a very high bar. What's next? And can I help create it? Because I think we are not done helping animals, and we are definitely not done helping the planet. And there are way too many smart people out there that can figure this out better than I probably could.
Okay. Well, I wish you the best with GoodHumans. So for people who want to try to do what you just said and use their cranial capacity to try to figure out this vexing problem of how we're going to feed humanity without destroying the planet and tormenting billions of animals in the process, were the resources that you would recommend, things that you have benefited from that maybe they should check out that will help them in their own journey?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that's helped me over everything, and also kudos to you too, Paul, because you've also used this too, is just you're increasing your ability to tell scientific stories, science communication, we might call it. Probably the most important thing that I learned outside of just like, being emotionally intelligent. But I'd recommend, if you're willing to sort of look into something more like almost like a very lay textbook, a great book called The Science of Science. It's recently come out. And I'm going to butcher the author's last name. He's an incredible professor. Albert Laszlo Berbasi is the author. And he compiles the most recent work around what it takes to actually be an effective scientist in today. And I think there's very actionable principles in there around how to actually improve your chances of making a big dent. And one of them that you and I have both done too, which is like taking big risks. Like big, scary risks professionally. I think that's probably the number one thing. And then my second recommendation that's always helped me is reading contemporary fiction and contemporary science fiction and even historical. Like I didn't even get into science fiction until my 30s. And it helps unlock a mind creatively. So if you're looking to get started, there's a million ways. But just because I'm reading it currently, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is just a fantastic fantasy sci-fi novel to start with. But there are, of course,
the Name of the Wind. That's what you said? That's
right. And of course, if you want even a little bit more hard sci-fi, The Three-Body Problem, which is also such an incredible series to get into as well.
Yeah. I really loved Three-Body Problem. I only read the first book, but I absolutely loved it. And then I watched the Netflix series after that, and it was good too. I liked it. I liked the book better, but I did like the series too, and enjoyed it. But yeah, it was really good. And I am a avid reader of fiction, so I am a big, and especially sci-fi. So I appreciate your commentary here, because I know there's a lot of people who I'm friends with who are very smart, who think it's a waste of their time to read fiction. And I vociferously disagree. And I don't know if I'm just trying to rationalize it because I personally enjoy it, but I think it actually is useful.
I will tell you, as a scientist who went to a liberal arts undergrad, the most important lesson I still remember to this day is, and so I studied both biology and English literature. The thing that has more of a bearing on my day-to-day life as executive and scientist is, first off, my English literature aspect and training. But I had a professor who told me, if you want to know what the world will look like in 20 years, read contemporary fiction. And that has never proven to be wrong to me. So I just think that keeping up and reading things about today, and people tend to have subtle cues to like where society is going in the future. And I just think there's so much to mine in fiction to keep you away. The most boring people I know only talk about their profession. So I think the most interesting people are the most curious, and therefore are interested. If they're scientists, they're interested in the magical world of the imagination, aka fiction.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll give you one recommendation first and foremost. I wouldn't necessarily say it's sci-fi. It's more like dystopian, futuristic fiction, but it's called Tender is the Flesh. It's a really good book by, I can't remember if the author is, I can't remember if she's Chilean or Argentinian. I can't remember which, but anyway, she won a ton of awards for it. It's a really great look, and it is relevant to the topics that we've been discussing today. And I also went on I got really obsessed with like 19th century animal protection fiction, like Black Beauty and other books in that vein that had really, really amazing effects on actual society. Like all these books, these fiction books that had really major impacts in society, like Black Beauty. And I will include a link to some of the ones that I read in case you're interested in going back and reading some of those really cool.
Amazing.
Books too. Yeah.
And because I want to recommend one other, since it's my contemporary fiction outside of sci-fi, is The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut as well. Also, a sort of stylized biography of arguably the smartest person that's ever lived on this planet, von Neumann.
Okay, The Maniac.
So,
yeah. All right. I can't imagine that anybody would ever write a biography of me, but if they did, that might be the title. So there would be some competition. Listen, Eric, it's great to be talking with you. I really admire the trajectory that your career has taken. I wish you the best with GoodHumans, and thanks so much for giving us your thoughts on where the cultivated meat industry is, where it's going, and what needs to be done to get there. So good luck with everything, and we'll talk with you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.